Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here. We'll get things rolling in just a minute or two, as our friends join us in the webinar today. So welcome to the Shaping a Future of Food. We are so happy to have you here. My name is Colin Kern, and Lily, you can get us to the next slide if you're ready as well. I usually say a bit more about IATP and what we do, but you're going to hear plenty of that from us today. So I'm going to hold off on my broader remarks. But as a reminder, we're the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. At the core of our work is creating and building sustainable food and agriculture systems, which is a lot. There's a lot to do in that, and that we could probably have a whole webinar about this single sentence here, right, Sophia? We could spend a lot of time doing that. With that being said, though, you guys are here to hear from two of our wonderful colleagues, our Director of Climate and Rural Strategies, Ben Lilliston, and our Executive Director, Sophia Murphy. I suspect most of you are familiar with us, and if you're not, we're just happy to have you here today. So with that, I'm going to hand off, I guess I'll stay on the call, but I'm going to hand off the speaking reins to you two and get things rolling here. So like I mentioned, Sophia, I usually talk about what we are and what we do, but I want to ask you as our executive director, what is IATP and who are we?
Thank you for that, Colin, and thank you to everyone here. It's a pleasure to see some really old familiar friends and names in the list and people I haven't had the chance to meet as well. So IATP is coming up on its 40th anniversary, quite a good long lineage for a nonprofit organization, a non-government organization would be another word for us, and a civil society organization is something that has emerged in our 40 years as a way to talk about what we do. And we were founded in a farm justice movement that was focused on prices, markets, a fairer deal for farmers, both in their relationship with the government and what the understanding was of what public policy would be for farms and farming, and in terms of markets and the fights that farmers had to get fair prices, both as buyers of inputs like chemicals and fertilizers, and the sale price, most importantly, for what they did produce. And so there were fights about that economy and there were fights about politics, and those fights continue and they're part of how we define who we are. And a second defining element of IATP that has been part of us from the beginning was that we were interested in understanding how farmers elsewhere were coping with similar struggles and how they were looking at trade relationships, but also domestic farm policy in their countries. So our board has always had these international members and component, and our organization has always been invested in Minnesota, which is where we're founded and where our heart still is. Also in the national debate as an organization and coalitions, and then always also at the international level, which is especially important, I think, for anyone and any organization based in the United States. We have an outsized role in the world, outsized impact on things that happen elsewhere. It's important for us to understand that and to be a voice, sometimes quite often in dissent with our government, but always speaking out for what else is going on in this country and learning from others. And then the last thing I would say in terms of what we do is we're basically part of political movements, coalitions, organizing around realizing change. And that's with farmers organizations, often food consumers, any part of the food system, really, you could find as trade unions, with farm workers, environmentalists looking to figure out better ways to protect the resource base we all depend on for our food system. And as IATP, we in particular bring often research analysis. What do we know? How do we know it? How can we make sure that political movements are equipped for the arguments they're going to have, debates? And then we go into those debates because we believe that public policy matters. What is decided in our name by the governments we vote for, local, national, again, also the US in its role abroad. How do we shape that, change that? How do we get policy that works for us? Colin, yeah.
I muted myself. Anywho, thank you, Sophia. Thanks for giving us that update and kind of giving us the broader context of what IATP is. Ben, I'm going to start with you here. In these webinars, we often feature a specific event or topic or piece of work that IATP has been doing. And so we have some of that coming up later this fall. We had some of those webinars this spring, if any of you are interested in catching up on some of our previous work. But Ben, why don't you give us a little bit of a forecast on what IATP is focusing on this fall, what we've been working on, what's in the development process?
Yeah, well, thanks, Colin. Thanks everybody for joining. Yeah, I do direct our climate and rural strategies work at IATP, but a lot of our work is cross-sectional, so we all work a little bit on everything, I would say, and take different pieces of it. Um, so there's a couple of things. One, the Farm Bill is set to expire at the end of this month. We may also have is, a budget or a government shutdown that's going on. So we're tracking that very closely, trying to engage with partners. The Farm Bill political environment is very difficult, as you can imagine. What's happening in Washington, the divisiveness, the difficulty to get anything done, and certainly anything that substantial and positive, is very challenging. But that is something that we're working very closely with partners on, and we'll be tracking throughout the rest of this year. Um, Maybe a more positive note, we're doing a lot of work around corporate accountability and climate disclosure. And that is one of these areas that operates outside of Washington. So just as things have been closed down in Washington, there are new opportunities open up elsewhere. Um, California will be implementing some pretty groundbreaking climate disclosure rules that will begin at the beginning of next year. It will affect most big food and ag companies. And so we're going to be putting out a climate reporting disclosure scorecard next month that will look at some of these big companies and what they're disclosing on climate emissions and climate risk. Um, we're also working in Europe around Europe's 2040 climate target and how to include agriculture within that, particularly agriculture methane emissions. They're undergoing some of the same debates that we're having here. Well, not at the federal level, but about how to move forward on agriculture, how to create a transition, a climate transition that reduces emissions and works for farmers. And so we're engaged in their 2040 target plan, and they're also looking at different market mechanisms and agriculture, carbon market, and so forth. We're pretty deeply engaged in that. We'll talk a little bit later about the USMCA, which is basically the updated NAFTA agreement between the US, Canada, and Mexico. There'll be some opportunities this fall to engage in what is a renegotiation or reassessment process. So might be opportunities to improve that. And then I would say we're also sort of preparing for the Minnesota state legislature session, which will start next year. But it's a very different environment right now. Budgets are extremely tight. And so we want to be able to protect the good programs that are around there, particularly around farm to school and farm to institution and local community foods, and see what opportunities there may be to expand that in this really challenging environment. So
Yeah.
those are some things.
Yeah, just a few things. Got lots coming up and lots we've already been working on. I'll just highlight, Ben mentioned the climate disclosure rulings and how more work's gonna be coming out on that, but we did a feature webinar with Leela Yao, who's been leading that work. And so if you're interested in more of that, you can read some of her material or go back and find the webinar that covered that material, and we can set that up in the follow-up. Sophia, I want to give you a chance to touch on anything coming up this fall that ITP has been working on.
I would just throw a couple of international things into the mix. We'll have a chapter in the next iteration of the Global Land Gap Report that is looking at how trade structures make it hard to reform commodity markets, which in turn makes it hard to stop the deforestation that is a huge reason for biodiversity loss, but also an important part of the problem of climate change. So that should be coming out sometime in November, around the time of the Climate Conference of the Parties, or COP, in Brazil. And the work that we've been doing for the last couple of years on an alternative set of an alternative treaty for agriculture at the global level for global ag trade is now in its kind of outreach point. We have a draft treaty, and there'll be a series of webinars over the fall and into the winter with to talk about different aspects of that with different audiences. And so would love anyone who's interested to be thinking about that to keep an eye on our website, but also let us know, make sure you're on a list to see when those come up. So
Yeah.
those are just a couple more things to throw in.
Cool. And we're going to keep rolling with you, Sophia. Ben mentioned the USMCA negotiations coming up. Could you give us your perspective on what you see happening with those renegotiations?
Yeah, I mean, briefly, and then those many of you know, Karen Hansen-Kuhn is our lead on that. I think we are all in a state of uncertainty around what will happen on any given area of policy with the government. But this version, it was the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. It became USMCA in the first Trump administration, and there was some important revisions to the agreement then. It's hard to know how Trump sees it now. It's not because his administration supported it that they would necessarily continue it, but there's been no sign that they would abandon it yet, except, of course, that the tariffs, especially with Canada, have not been conducive to good relationships. But in practice, that agreement still governs relations for trade in for the three countries. And so we're going ahead, and it's a great opportunity for us anyway to work with the close partners we have in Mexico and Canada on our trade strategy. And we're seeing it as an opportunity to develop what we want to see. And if it happens with this administration, that's great. And if it doesn't, there'll be in another administration and another chance. And I think it's about raising the quality of what we trade, pushing for things like country of origin labeling, places, any initiative that can make food from somewhere count, because it's from food from somewhere that we get a chance to think about the quality of what it is, environmental impact, the impact for farmers and communities on what the production is for. So we're looking for opportunities to build out those things in the USMCA in particular.
Great.
Yeah, I'd just add real quickly, supposedly in October, the U.S. Trade Representative will start taking some public input on what should be part of this reassessment. So if you're interested in this, keep an eye out. We'll publicize a little bit about that and what priorities we'll be pushing for within that process. And then in the beginning of next year, they sort of take that public input and then take their positions, I think starting in January, lay out what they're going to be pushing for in a renegotiated USMCA, and that'll happen throughout the year, the whole process. But we'll have to see, as Sophia said, how open it actually is, how open they are to input. But we do think mandatory country of origin labeling, because beef prices are kind of a big deal right now, and we are importing more and more beef, that there may be an opportunity to make some advancements around that issue.
Thanks for that update, Ben. I'm going to keep it on you, Ben, here. We've seen attacks on climate science and climate nonprofits coming from the Trump administration this whole year and in the past. And there was a question here of how has IATP responded to those attacks, or what would you want to say on that subject?
To say, I mean, the Trump administration has just been devastating on undercutting climate action. So I don't need to reiterate all the things that are happening. But really the attacks on science, I mean, you're flying blind, right? Attacks on NOAA, just monitoring greenhouse gas emissions from that perspective, telling USDA that you can't really mention climate change on the whole website throughout all these programs is pretty damaging, because we know farmers are dealing with it. I noticed drought mentioned multiple times in the chat, and then last week the EPA said they're basically not going to track greenhouse gas emissions anymore through the greenhouse gas inventory, which is a really important tool that ITP and others have used to check on progress, and it digs in on agriculture emissions, whether it's from animals or fertilizer, or other sources of emissions. So not having those tools, it makes it more challenging. I think the opportunity potentially is states trying to step up and take more action. California already has a pretty good, robust climate reporting system. Other states also rely on the EPA, so it'll be interesting to see how much they step up on sort of just even measuring and tracking what's going on. I think the attacks on civil society groups pushing for climate is very concerning. Even just the verbal attacks and creating this environment that's very hostile about talking about climate change. I think it's important for groups to keep talking about it. We're going to keep talking about it, and to be in solidarity if something specific happens, like a specific attack. Um, we have had a grant cut at IATP. I don't know, Sophia may talk a little bit about that. That wasn't climate related, but it was DEI related to a project that we were working on community food systems, and we were able to legally challenge that and get that grant reinstated. A lot of groups are facing that. A lot of groups are doing that. So I think this is something that's not just about IATP, but really the larger movement for change, and to be able to speak freely. It's a First Amendment issue, but much deeper than that. So I'll leave it there, but this is a real challenge for sure.
Yeah, it certainly is. Sophia, do you want to comment briefly on the lawsuit?
Um, well, only to say that it's part of the context wherein that, you know, the breaking of the contract that we had with USDA was clearly illegal. It didn't get nobody saw it and thought that it wouldn't be that the government was justified, and we didn't expect to hear so quickly and to win so quickly. That was encouraging, and the money for us began immediately again, which gave the sense that you know, within the administration, there are people who still want to do this work. They're frustrated, I think, by decision, but there's still already been a kind of a decision by the Supreme Court that puts into doubt again the question that the Supreme Court was challenging the authority of the district courts to rule in these cases at all, in a further attempt, it seems, to keep consolidating power with an executive rather than keeping power with the legislative branch of the government. So it was all in that realm. It was good that IATP was able to challenge this, because for us, it wasn't a high risk. For many of our partners, it's a much higher risk. They're much more involved in federal funding and the uncertainty of that, but also simply the cut of large amount of money also to public education. We have it in another context as part of the Minnesota Institute for Sustainable Agriculture, which is work in the state that we do, trying to kind of bring farmer knowledge into the academy, and for the academy to pay more attention to what farmers and farm workers and food system people know, and to direct better research and responsiveness to that. We've been caught up in the whole huge cut to public education across the whole country. I mean, the last thing I will say that I think is one of the simple, biggest challenges to us is this idea of truth, the idea of knowledge, the idea that there could be an answer to the question, is climate change real or not? That the administration has made it harder than ever to start with the facts and then build out.
Man, again, we could spend a lot of time on that last part there, Sophia, but we'll continue on here with a question of how have tariffs and chaotic pivots in trade policies impacted farmers in the US and abroad? And this is for you, Sophia.
Yeah, I'm sure Ben will also have some things to say. I mean, I think it's been devastating. So we have two systems going on, and it's true that a lot of NGOs like IATP, we find ourselves a little bit caught up in, well, we have seen historically and think of tariffs as simply another policy. It's a taxation. Do you want to tax this behavior or not? And there are times and systems like a supply management system where you'd want that tax because it's a way of protecting what you're building in the country for production and circulation of goods that privileges local. But overall, what Trump has done is throw international markets into turmoil, throw markets that have been the basis for the large share of US agriculture since we were founded, and then some, so 40 or more years, and has created doubt in the minds of those who are importing US commodity that the US will not be reliable. It's especially acute with China, where the administration has been especially antagonistic. And as a result, we've lost vast sums of contract, and farmers are looking for a place now to sell these commodities that we grow in abundant quantity. So the effect of the tariffs, I don't think we've started to feel it yet. Maybe the other thing I will say is that we saw, in fact, in anticipation of tariffs, a lot of increase in activity, a flurry of things trying to anticipate where tariffs would come and to get in ahead of them. That time is out. And for farmers, that time didn't so much exist. They can't advance their harvest. The harvest takes the time it takes. And so they've lost those contracts now and are looking for a place to put soy. And you can see it in the returns on the cooperatives that, you know, agribusinesses like Cargill have different markets, different places. We'll see what happens to them overall. The US is only one of their markets where they source. But especially for the US-based companies that are consolidating product and selling it for farmers abroad, we're going to see, I think we already see falling returns, and I suspect that's going to just get worse.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something we've continued to cover, and there will be more coverage, I'm sure, on in our Ben. What are you going to add to that?
This is going to add real quickly.
Yeah,
Costs have gone up for a lot of things for farmers and related to these tariffs, farmers of all types, so equipment, um, energy and fuel, anything like buildings, things that farmers need to pay for. All those costs have already gone up, just like they have for a lot of us. And then, as Sophia pointed out, a lot of markets have been lost, during the course of planting season. So it wasn't like farmers had a chance to really plan for this, even though some of this may have been predictable. Um, and so right now prices are plunging for a lot of
yeah,
commodity crops.
yeah. And along with all that, we're seeing changes to these communities due to immigration policy and enforcement. Ben, would you comment on how farming communities are being impacted by what we're seeing on the immigration side of things?
Yeah, so I think many people are aware that a lot of our food system is very dependent on immigrant labor, both in the field, fruit and vegetable production in particular, in dairies, and particularly bigger dairies really rely on it. And then in meat processing as well. There's no doubt that all those industries are being affected. We don't have great numbers on, how many farms are losing, their labor. But you hear farm groups talk about it, you hear farmers talk about it, you hear anecdotal specific stories. There's just a story in the New York Times about a dairy in Pennsylvania that lost his workers there. Uh, so it is definitely having an impact. And I think, as Sophia said, we haven't quite felt it fully yet in the food system. Um, but it's coming. And it's not just the arrests, it's the terroristic sort of environment that's being created. Um, that is a real problem. And there's no sort of plan around it. And I think that's what's really troubling. It's the same with the tariffs, is there's no real plan to build something different, to create a different type of immigration status or policy or path to citizenship or anything really about how we're going to address this worker situation. Um, the idea that Americans are going to fill these jobs is pretty naive, and we're not close to something like that happening. And so it's a fragile system in many ways, and I think we're seeing that both in the worker disruption as well as tariff disruption. Um, and I fear that this fall and into next year, we're going to see some real rises in food prices, and of course that's going to hit low income people the hardest.
Yeah. And on that front as well, Ben, in terms of like the damage being done to rural communities, we've seen USDA staff getting cut and USDA offices being their leases being terminated or not renewed. Do you mind commenting also like on yeah, what are we seeing there? What impact that's going to have in the agricultural landscape here?
Yeah, I mean, this is it's like a perfect storm is being created here for many farmers and people in the food system. I mean, you have the tariffs, you have the tax on workers, and now you're really disinvesting in the government and government agencies, government programs, the ability to administer those programs. Uh, all types of farmers depend on USDA, both conventional farmers or farmers targeting local markets or organic farmers. There are different types of programs for different types of farmers. And, we already would say that the USDA was understaffed, even going in before the Trump administration. It was difficult for smaller scale farmers to access programs. We know that. We've documented that in the conservation programs. Um, so fewer staff means more difficult for farmers to access programs, and the more likelihood that they will send the money to the larger operations. It's easier for them to administer fewer grants or fewer sort of whether it's loans to larger operations, to fewer larger operations than a bunch of small grants and a bunch of small loans. So we're deeply concerned about that. USDA has a whole reorganization plan where they plan to move from DC to different places in the country. That may make sense if it was that part of a real plan. But we fear that the real goal of that is to get a lot of people to quit at USDA and to further downsize and to lose more people. So this is a real problem. It's a real challenge, and this is going to play out over the next year or so as well. This webinar is getting real dark, Colin.
Yeah, I'll try to turn a corner here, but we might not get there this time fully. I'll just add to what Ben was speaking to about the USDA cuts and closures. Michael Happ, one of our program associates here at IATP, has been covering that more closely as well. So you can look out for publications from him. We even did a webinar with him on the programs that USDA helps administer and the access that we saw increase actually prior to this year, which we now expect to decline following what we're seeing happening. So if those interest you, I'd encourage you to look out for those resources. I can include those in the follow-up as well. All right, maybe on a brighter note, I don't know if it will be, but Sophia, we had a question here. What can consumers do to support small family farmers other than buy at farmers markets? So maybe, maybe there's a plug here for some opportunity for us to channel our frustration.
Well, I think thinking as a consumer about what you do is very important. And your chance, it's a way of expressing yourself. It's a kind of voice, if you like, in the marketplace, and one we should take seriously. And I think understanding where your food comes from is one of the big things. And understanding that you start in on that, it's going to get complicated pretty quickly because as an individual consumer, you've got fairly limited power, but you have some and should use it. And there are great organizations. IATP is not especially focused on consumer issues, but there are great organizations out there who are. But I would just urge you also to think of the citizen opportunities, not just the consumer, because you also have a political voice, and all of us have a chance to weigh in, not just in the marketplace, but also in shaping the decisions that are made. And that's not just as someone who might vote occasionally in an election, as you are able to, but also in what your neighborhood does. My neighborhood has a great food share program underway. It's all volunteer led. There's a little bit of money from the city that comes to neighborhoods. We use that to channel in and get food to people who need it. Some of these things are our activist or citizen side, but not necessarily just in the formal part of what governments are doing. But so just to be thinking about that, our government choices matter, local, city, state, national, our international behavior matters. And it's surprising where you can have a voice and influence. So just say one last thing there. Internationally, there aren't very Americans paying attention to what the government does abroad, especially now in a time where the country domestically is in such crisis. And that means you can be heard and have unusual access to your government out of the country. Easier than in Washington, D.C., for example, is from my experience, you go to the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, you can talk to the American diplomats who are making decisions there. So I really encourage people to think about that as well, where and how your government shows up and where you want to be, just like a local town hall is one opportunity. There are different kinds of spaces and places for us to engage as humans in the system.
Yeah. Thanks, Sophia. And to all of you who have invited your colleagues, friends, and families to, participate in some of these conversations or join us, that this work can't happen in a vacuum. It happens in conversation, as Sophia is saying. And there's also something I always highlight at the start of these webinars when I give like the IATP spiel. It's like, this is not the work of a single administration. IATP has been here for 40 years. We're going to be here longer still. And that's because we couldn't fix it in the first administration, and we're going to get through this one and find more opportunity down the road as well. Sophia, we were just on a call earlier today that was about one of these questions here. I just want to give you a chance to touch on it briefly as folks are interested. How is IATP responding to the latest MAHA Make America Healthy Again strategy report?
Yeah, that's something we should, well, one thing to say, look, watch out because we will do more. I think probably more though into October, November to respond. But just briefly to say for us, this Make America Healthy Again has been a sort of frustrating and interesting opportunity where a lot of issues we care about are raised, for example, challenges or health problems related to ultra processed foods, especially large consumption of that. Um, Problems with factory farming, which has been an issue for IATP for 40 years. But then as soon as we start to look at what the content is, and I haven't read that report, but colleagues are noting how quick it is to read, and there's just not a lot of detail or content. But when you get to the proposals, it's not really addressing the things both that we know already and don't need further research, or the political action that would be required to make a change. I do not think this administration has either the courage or even the particular motivation to take on the vested interests that are behind the problems identified. And so I think I fear it'll be another place of great incoherence. People can get hopeful. We'll see some headlines, but underneath it, it's going to be very difficult to, I think we'll be disappointed if we think the administration is going to take effective action. There's no sign of that yet in these MAHA reports.
Mhm. Thanks, Sophia. We've had a few questions in the chat come up. We have just a little bit of time here, but I'm going to try to hit a few of these with all of you. Ben, we had a couple of questions on biofuels and sustainable aviation fluid. I'm not or sustainable aviation fuel. I know it's not fluid. Some folks were wondering what work IATP might be doing on those issues and those topics. And one person was wondering what prospects there are for reducing the amount of land devoted to biofuels. Any any thoughts you'd care to share on that?
Yeah. I think we see the biofuels debate as fitting within the larger agriculture economy. So just taking answering both those questions together, um, the reason we have biofuels largely is because we have an excess amount of corn and soy, and people are trying to figure out what do we do with that. And right now, because of the tariffs and the loss of export markets, you're going to say we definitely have a glut of soybeans, and they're projecting this is going to be one of the biggest corn harvests ever. So we have a glut of corn. Um, and I think that the big farm groups and certainly the biofuel industry are like, well, we can help with that. Let's take up some of that. It's also going to be those will be sources of really cheap feed for large factory farms. So they may benefit from this huge glut. Um, but in the bigger picture with the Trump administration, which is, full of contradictions, but I think one consistent kind of perspective that they have is they will choose oil above all else. And the oil industry essentially runs the Trump administration on a bunch of different areas. And so in some ways they've been a little bit hostile to biofuels, and not embracing it. Um, so, for ITP, we kind of sit biofuels within this larger context of our farm policy, our farm bill, and we believe we're producing way too much corn and soy already. We don't think it's necessarily a climate solution, particularly those commodity crops. There have been some pushing other types of crops and biofuels, but it's very hard to get into that market when you have really cheap corn, below cost corn and below cost soy. So this is where this sits right now. And if you consider biogas a biofuel, which is something where basically they take the gas from factory farms and pipe it into natural gas pipelines, that is something we've been very much against and opposing for quite a while. And that industry is struggling a little bit right now. Trump has thrown a lot of these different markets into chaos, and particularly ones that are around climate change. So I didn't directly answer that, but that's how we're thinking about it and how we see those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Ben.
And maybe to jump in, I think another piece of work that, there's sort of what are we doing like this month? And then there's some ongoing, longstanding work. But one of the issues we're really beginning to dig into is to better map what we actually grow, because we've seen a pattern where the US, although it's still a huge ag commodity exporter, we're actually a net importer now of agricultural things. And that's because we import more and more of our food. And we're trying to bring a bit of a distinction between food and other commodities, the use of land for different things. And around that, to be making a case that, as Ben was saying, we need to grow a lot less of this corn and soy, which has so much environmental damage associated with it as well, and keep more space for food. And maybe that goes a little bit to that paradigm question, Colin, that I see there from Tomaj around, what is the paradigm change? One of the paradigm changes is to prioritize food production and to see that as a sort of basic need, like housing and education, as opposed to simply a commodity for a more kind of capitalist type exchange commodification on an international market.
Mhm. Sophia, that kind of ties into one more question here that I think we could spend the last couple minutes on. That's related to the change that you were just discussing. But here's the question. In light of the elimination or at least the shrinking of traditional export markets, do you see pivots to new markets as a viable strategy? In addition to that, are there any indications that there's interest from the government to help, if they said mitigate the perfect storm we've laid out, but perhaps to also usher in an alternative, a pivot to a different market? So it's kind of two questions, both like, is it viable and is there support in any capacity for that, a pivot of sorts?
Maybe to answer it backwards, and maybe I'm underestimating or not seeing some of the things that are there, but I have not seen from mainstream through to more radical critique. I have not seen anyone claim that there's a vision here or a strategy from the government to do something about markets for farmers. The only strategy I've seen is a very large amount of money put aside in the budget reconciliation bill that we had, the so-called big, I don't know, beautiful bill, where large amount of money would go to commodity growers to just try and buy them off, really. But there's not any sense that I've seen that this will be used as an opportunity to build. But there is opportunity. And one of the very disappointing things about cuts to the US Department of Agriculture have been cuts to the local food procurement and distribution systems that were really getting significant funding at the end of the Biden administration. And we're really building on community-led initiatives that had laid the way, and the state too had invested in laying the way for more food production circulating in smaller scale markets, shorter supply chains. And I think that there will be opportunity, whether or not the government has a plan. There is definitely opportunity for us to be looking at what else do we do to maybe also reverse this trend of increasing amounts of imported, fairly expensive food, which has big implications for the food systems in those countries where that food originates as well, in terms of their water use, their food production, their access. And how can we build stronger markets for our food here in anticipation of a time where, with a government that was thinking strategically and practically about a food, vision, what would we have to show them? What could we give them as examples?
Well, thanks, Sophia and Ben, so much. We're going to cap the questions there right now. There's, of course, more we could discuss, but I want to highlight a few things coming up from IATP this next month. Lily, if you would show those slides for us. The first one is another webinar happening at the beginning of October, October 1st. And here we are with that. The processing and productions methods matter. Sophia, you're going to be on that panel, that webinar. Do you mind giving us give us a little pitch on why we should stop by, what we might expect?
No, it'll definitely be for trade nerds, but I hope it'll be
Yeah.
for others as well. It's looking at this question of how do we distinguish what we sell, not only by the final product as a commodity, but actually how it was produced and where it came from. So this question, as I said, of food from somewhere, but also what quality of food. And I think I just briefly saw Thierry was asking a question about governance. I think part of the governance will be changing the rules around trade, and this will be really digging into that work that IATP has been invested in around what other trade rules could we have, what new trade rules could we have that would support us paying attention to quality and not simply to the cheapness of what's sold in trade markets.
Yeah. Well, make sure you register for this webinar coming up in a few weeks here. We have a couple other notes to highlight. If we go to our next slide, Lily, we've got Farm Aid this weekend here in Minneapolis. So if you have been planning to attend or haven't yet, there might still be tickets available. I'm not positive, but it's happening. If you want to come see some great performers and be a part of this bigger conversation and collection, we're really excited. We have a booth at the Homegrown Village. So if you're stopping by Farm Aid, say hello to some of us at IATP. We've got some games. You can come learn about some, food system material and have some fun while you're at it. So come stop by, check in with the staff at Farm Aid and enjoy the show. On October 1st, like we mentioned, there will be the trade webinar that Sophia just highlighted. And then in mid-October, we're planning an additional webinar about World Food Day and Farm to School Month. So keep your eyes and ears out for that. And I just want to say thank you again for being here. Again, this work can't happen in a vacuum. Thank you to Sophia and Ben for your wonderful participation. Sophia, it is good to have you back from Sri Lanka. I think we've got a lot more to hear about that. So we'll look
Another
forward to
time,
more.
but thanks everyone. Thanks, Colin, for
Yeah,
hosting.
cool.
Take
Cheers,
care.
everybody. Have a good day. Bye-bye.